On this first episode of our fourth season of the Camp Owners Podcast, we have Steve and Susie Baskin. They are incredibly wise and knowledgeable about all things camp. And today, to narrow that down, we are talking about their approach to succession and how they are doing that with Camp Champions. And they share so much fantastic wisdom and advice and things for individuals to think about, whether or not you are going to be going within your family for the succession of your camp and things for you to consider, or if you're going to go the route that they are and not have the camp continue with their family. So please take a listen. We hope you enjoy it. I know that I got so much out of it, and we hope you do too. Welcome to the Camp Owners Podcast, a space for camp owners to talk about the unique aspects of camp ownership and get inspired by each other. We are going to sit down with camp industry experts, leaders, and fellow camp owners to hear how the camp dream transpired for them, learn from each other, and discuss some of the biggest issues in the private camp industry. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Schuna, and I am the co-owner and executive director of Hidden Pines Ranch Day Camp, located in Stillwater, Minnesota.
Hi, everybody. I'm Howie Grossinger. I am the co-owner of Camp Robin Hood, a day camp in the suburbs of Toronto, and also a co-owner of Camp Walden, overnight camp about 3 hours north of Toronto, north of the border for a lot of our listeners, of course, but it's a beautiful fall here. If you're looking to find and subscribe to the Camp Owners Podcast, you can either find us online at gocamp.pro Owners Pod or by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Finally, if you're listening to this and think it would be useful to other camp owners or aspiring camp owners in your circle, please feel free to send them a note to listen. Hello, Kelly.
Hi, Howie. Yay, season 4, our first episode. This is really exciting to be back in the saddle after a summer of camp.
They actually had us back. Like, we're back. We renegotiated whatever we renegotiated, and we're back. It's amazing. Yeah. It's wonderful. It's so great. This is above 50 episodes is the beginning of this journey, which is really super awesome. And I'm excited for you to introduce our guests, because one of them is like the OG number one. So for those who have been along this journey with us, I can't wait for you to introduce our guests. But Kelly, it's so great. After another summer, we're back. So happy to kick off another season with you.
Yep, you too. We did it. We survived another camp season. It always feels like a big feat. And to come on the other side better for it. I'm super excited about our guests. I was thinking about this earlier, and I was like, how am I going to introduce them? Is it like the power couple of camping? Is it the legends of camping? I really was trying to think of the best way to describe them. I don't even know if any of that does it justice. But before we have them introduce themselves, we do have the Baskins on today.
Yes.
Steve and Susie, and they are talking about a topic that I'm really excited about. They did a session on it at the CODA conference. So shout out to CODA, the Camp Owners and Directors Conference. And they did this in one of the breakouts, and I didn't get to attend. So I'm kind of selfishly asking them to come in to talk about it. But I think it's a topic that's incredibly applicable to camp owners, future aspiring camp owners, about their unique approach to succession in their camp. So Susie and Steve, welcome to the Camp Owners Podcast. It's so great to have the two of you on together.
We're delighted to be here.
So what we'll do before we get into your approach to succession is we would love, Howie and I would love for the two of you to introduce yourselves and kind of give your camp origin story about how you got into camping and where that has led you and what you're doing today.
You want to go first?
All right. Yeah, I'm Steve Baskin, and I've been doing this since 1993. I don't come from camp directly in my family, but indirectly in my family. My aunt and uncle are involved, and along with my cousin now, Camp Stewart and Camp Heart of the Hills. And I went to Camp Stewart when I was 8 years old. And I went as a very shy and confident little boy, and I was sent for 5 weeks. And while I was there, I learned that a 19-year-old or 20-year-old counselor could think that his life was made complete because the unconfident little guy was in it. And it was sort of a sea change in the way I saw myself. And about 8 years later, I did something at camp that's kind of equivalent of like an Eagle Scout, and that became something I would write about in my college applications. And I like to say I was raised by two of the greatest people in the world, but two of the 6 most seminal experiences of my life happened at summer camp. Now, I would like to say that I looked at the stars that night and said, "Oh, someday I'll be a camp director," but I did it. I went to school in North Carolina and in London. Then I worked in finance in New York and Houston, and then did graduate work in Boston. But while there, I kind of had the opportunity to reassess my life and decide that while I was pretty good at finance, I didn't love it. And I only had one life. So I thought, what if I could go do something that made an impact in kids' lives? And here was something that had twice done so for me. So I went about trying to find a way to get into the camp world. And my brother and I at the time partnered. We started a camp from scratch. And in 93, we bought another camp between the summers of 95 and 96 as camp champions, and since. So but that leaves out the most important thing that happened to me in that period of time was running into Susan Osborne. So now you're part of the story.
Right, I am. So Steve and I met in Boston, and I never went to camp growing up, and really it didn't occur to me because my parents hadn't, and I didn't know anybody else who did, except for one friend, and she went for 8 weeks, and that just seemed impossible, leaving the entire summer. So when I met Steve in Boston, and here he is in business school, right? But all he talks about is camp. And I thought he was a little bonkers, but you know how like camp people love camp. And so I thought, oh, that's good for him. How nice, right? But then we fell in love. We decided to get married. Meanwhile, after undergrad, I moved back to Boston. I'm from Boston. And I was on my way to graduate school in Chicago. So we had like a long distance thing, Boston to Chicago. He was a year ahead of me in grad school. So he graduated a year before I did. He moved to Texas. Then we had Chicago to Texas. And I moved after having lived, in the Northeast and the Midwest. And I moved to rural Marble Falls, Texas, where we were married. And then, we just barely had a Walmart. Now we have a super Walmart. Marble Falls has grown, a lot.
Hey, don't flex. We don't want to make people jealous.
So anyway, I moved here, but with my intention was when the camp that Steve and his brother founded, my intention was that I would be there a year-ish. It was kind of a long commute into Austin, and then we'd move into Austin, and I would go back to doing what I've done before, which is I've always worked in healthcare. I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and then I worked in a cancer hospital, and I had a background in psychology, and then a background in business. So I did healthcare administration, and that's what I thought my path would be. But camp hooked me in, and the joy, the energy, the connection, all those things, even that happened year round, which I think also surprised me because I thought it would be a summer only thing. But camp people are camp people all year round, and so I got involved in that, and then not 2 years later, I was pregnant with twins, and then had our third 17 months.
Wow.
Yeah, right. So we 3 under 2, and so I kind of did a part-time camp thing, and then we had one more 3 years later. So 4 children under the age of 5. I just don't remember those years of our life,
Right,
but
sure.
and I was kind of with my kind of accounting background stuff, I did back of the house stuff at camp. And then once our kids were old enough, I started to get involved in the day-to-day. And 2 things happened. One, I was front and center in the meat of camp and seeing how marvelous it was. But 2, our kids became old enough, our twin boys went to camp. And then, oh my gosh. And then I just had a totally different viewpoint of it and how much it did for kids. And so I just fell in love with it. At that point, there was no other career. And, I direct the infirmary camp, so I kind of get back to my roots a little bit, right?
For sure. If you were to, for our listeners, can you provide us with like an overview of Camp Champions overnight camp? outside of Austin? Like, give us a sense of geography and scope of the program that you founded and run.
Well, we actually, the one we founded, we're no longer associated with. We bought
Right.
Camp Champions in its 30th year. It was
Right.
mostly a sports camp. We bought it. It's now, I think, a transitional camp. We really, really focus on the outcomes for kids. We talk about being tech-free and happy, creating strong kids, being a place where we find what is precious in each other instead of what makes us mad, developing character, all those sort of non-cognitive, non-physical skills. We shoot archery and do crafts, but that's what we're doing while we're really doing the important stuff. We're mostly 2 and 3 week terms. It's co-ed. And we really, really focus on the developmental outcomes of camp. We want kids to be strong. We want them to be tech-free and happy. We want them to see themselves as great agents in their own lives, heroes in their own story. And we have an elaborate high school leadership program, which is really sort of our passion. And we're about to have our 59th summer. We are also owners at a camp called Camp Pinnacle, which is in North Carolina. Camp Champions is outside of Austin. Pinnacle is in North Carolina, outside of Asheville. And it's a lot like Camp Champions, just cooler, right? And then we're also involved day camp outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
Nice.
Okay. Awesome. So tell us then, what does your involvement look like today with particularly Camp Champions, and then lead us into kind of where you're at with succession and how you've come to this place of deciding what you're going to do and what you are going to do. We're really curious to hear about that.
Goodness, those are really big questions. And it was something that kind of, I think it happened slowly. Steve and I, in a way, are really lucky in that we were not expected to go into the summer camp business because we didn't grow up with it. And that kind of gave us the freedom to choose to be in it because we loved it and we believe in it, but also without any expectations. And so it also makes it easier to transition into a new role because we're first generation, right? I think it's a bigger deal when you're dealing with families who are second and third generation. It's the expectation, perhaps, but that continues. So we will absolutely remain in camp, without question. We're just looking to, since that we have 4 children, by the way. I went through their ages, but at this point, all of them have dreams about what they want to do in life.
And to bracket it, they're 26, 26, 25, and 22.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So they're adults.
They're adults, and they are all employed and all pursuing, the careers of their dreams at this point. They may decide later on to get into camp. Goodness knows they absolutely love camp, but we also were in a situation where a wonderful protege of ours who very much feels like one of the family. I'd say a child, but he's significantly older than child. I don't know, younger brother or something, but he grew up at Camp Champions and always wanted to own Camp Champions. So it seemed to happen organically that one day we were having these conversations about what his dreams were and what ours were. And it worked out really well. One of the things that we feel exceptionally lucky is because we engage in very clear communication with him and our expectations and his expectations. And his expectations were that we would be able to remain involved as long as we wanted to, and which we very much do. But we don't want to be at the helm forever. Camp is intense. Summers are exhausting. And I kind of want to transition from being a camp parent to maybe like a camp grandparent. Get to do certain areas of camp, but not all the areas of camp.
Well, and I grew up a sports fan, and I just remember the last years of Joe Namath's career. And why do I bring that up? Well, Joe Namath had 2 terrible knees. but he tried to squeeze 2 or 3 extra seasons out of it. And I remember him not as the guy who won Super Bowl III, but as the guy who looked pathetic on the field. And I can't pretend that we will be as good at camp directors at age 70 as we were at age 45 or 50. And so we kind of took a step back and said, all right, we went into camp kind of unconventionally. Let's take a step back and see, how do other organizations or industries do this? And we know that 300 years ago, if you were a butcher, or if your father was a butcher, you became a butcher. But nowadays, if your mother is an orthodontist, you don't assume your life will be in teeth, right? So
For sure.
we noticed something else, and I don't know if this is we try this out on you guys. If I were to go and ask any camp owner to put the next 3 things in order of importance. So item number 1 is one of your children runs your camp. Item number 2 is that your children and grandchildren will continue to get along with each other and enjoy each other's company for the next 40 years. And the third thing is the legacy of your camp. The things that you do and you've dedicated yourself to will continue after you're gone. Generally, what I found is people would put number 2 first. I want my family to love each other. Legacy second. And which of my children, or one of my children running the camp, would be third. But our observation is that people were acting as if the order was inverted. They would start with, which of my kids are going to run the camp? Mm-hmm. And I guess they just presumed that nothing would break up familiar harmony. They just presumed that their kids would be great at perpetuating the legacy. In fact, uniquely good at perpetuating the legacy. And having watched not just tens or dozens, but over 50 transitions, that has not been what I've observed. Generally observed is that families get torn apart, or at least have a high lot of tension. If one child takes it over and the other 3 are silent partners, or they all get in at the same time, there are a lot of different ways it can go bad. And well, we'll stop right there. I've got one other thought, but we've sort of done a little bit of a filibuster here. That makes sense.
It entirely does. And as someone who's experienced that myself as a young camp pro, and seeing, marrying into a family, we just celebrated our 63rd summer of Sari's parents being at our day camp, right?
Oh, wonderful.
And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And, and I think about all the things that you've just said, Steve and Susie, and how it's resonating with me personally in my own journey through transition to a second generation, and us embarking on the transition to a third generation, and looking at lessons learned from my own experience and what my wife Sari and I want to set up for the next consideration for this. It's all resonating with me so much. But you're right. I think that, this issue, I have the very funny story that I've shared with lots of people, is that when I was interviewing for staff positions when my kids were very young, and my kids are 30, 28, and 24, but when I was interviewing at home, my little guy, who was like 8 years old at the time, used to always entertain the next person up for the camp interview, and we would show them last year's camp video, and he was kind of the hype man warm-up crowd for going in to talk to Howie. And this young person who didn't know us very well said, "Hey, I see this is a family camp. Like, has your family owned this camp for a while?" And my little 8-year-old, who is 6 years younger than his eldest sister, looks at him and says, "Yeah, it's our family camp, but my sister's got dibs on it." And it was just his very early perception about just whatever we're talking about. It was just so funny. Many, many years later, my daughter is the only one who's expressed real interest in doing this, and we're trying to figure it all out over the next several years. But it's really interesting how this business, it's so unique, because I don't know if the window manufacturing family has those kinds of conversations, because camp is so different. But they I think every industry has its own particulars. But it's so interesting to see all the observations and hear about kind of the things you've observed to make the decisions that you have in this part of your life.
So when your kids are growing up, we always say, what do you want to be when you grow up? You can do anything you want. You want to be an astronaut. You want to be the president of the United States. I mean, camp owners don't say to our kids, well, other kids get to choose, but you don't. You have to be a camp owner because we were. So, everybody wants to give their kids freedom of choice. I think it's wonderful. Your daughter wants to be involved. When we were doing our presentation at CODA, we kind of took a poll in the crowd and we said, how many of you think that camp is harder now being a director than it was 20 years ago? And every single hand went up. And we said, what about the next 20 years? Will it be harder still? Do you know? And don't you want whomever is taking over your camp to want to take on that? Because this is what they want to do. Also, the other thing, our children love camp. I mean, they talk about how it shaped them as people. They want to get married at camp. They just, everything about it. But they can love it and still not want to run it.
Mhm.
They're not mutually exclusive. So we're trying to craft a way to put the camp first, to move it forward and keep the legacy of camp going and not have someone feel obligated to run it.
Well, and there was one other problem as well. And a lot of people don't think of it this way, but if you have 3 kids and one wants to go in the business or 2 wants to go in the business, let's assume that your camp is at least 90% of your net worth. How does that get equitably distributed among your kids? And what I like to say is that each one of us are not one person, we're 3 people. And we actually had a really fun set of slides. We had all of Susie. So there's Susie, the camp director. There's Susie, the investor, and Susie, the entrepreneur. And the one with entrepreneur, she looked like
Elizabeth Holmes.
Looked like Elizabeth Holmes. But anyway, but okay, first of all, there's Susie, the camp director.
That's a good image.
She does work. And if she were not there, we would have to hire someone else to be Susie, the camp director. And that's worth some amount of money. I don't know if it's $80,000, $100,000, whatever it might be. And if one of your children is a camp director, the other ones aren't, whoever's a camp director deserves that $100,000. Okay. Also, over the past 10 years, let's just say for 10 years, you've invested $10 million into your camp. That is $10 million you could have put into the stock market, in which case you would divide it evenly 3 ways among your kids. Right? Does that make sense? So if at the end of the year, and let's say you hope to get, 5% on your investment. So $500,000 a year is 5% of your $10 million. Okay, so that next, so the first $100,000 is paying someone to work. There's now $500,000 coming out that's really return on money invested for the family. That doesn't initially go to the director. That should go equally to everyone. And the last one is the entrepreneur. There's a brand that Hidden Pines or Waldorf had. If Camp Champions had an identical camp called Camp Loser, but in every other way, it's identically the same, no one would come to it. There's something to the brand of Camp Champions that gives it value in the market. That doesn't belong to any one person. That belongs to the whole family. So the first thing is distinct to the person doing the work, the directing. The other 2, we need to find a way to make that divisible among the kids, right? Now, our situation was such that none of the kids wanted to be the director. But if we had done this, we probably said, okay, well, you are the director, but you're not the owner director. We get paid to be the director, but we're going to have to find a way to make sure all of the family participates in, the family wealth, as it were, or the family business. And I know a lot of people sort of say, well, the one who wants to be in it should get the business. And that just, I couldn't explain to my children why that would be fair. Does that make sense?
So let's not forget the lifestyle element of camp. I mean, especially if you live at a camp like we have forever. I mean, what's a personal expense and what's a camp expense? And if you're the child who's the director, and the other ones are out there having, the different jobs and their own expenses.
But they're also owners.
And the grass is always greener, right? Everybody assumes someone else has it better.
Absolutely.
I had a friend, a college friend, and his dad had a very small manufacturing business. This is like in the 80s, and it wasn't thriving. And then he put it up for sale, and my friend's dad bought it. And at that time, all the other siblings were like, "You take it. We don't want it. It's been struggling." And they thought it was a bargain that he bought them out of their inheritance. Over the course of 15 years, they mortgaged their house twice, and they worked incredibly hard. My friend said they lived on rice and beans for years. Well, his dad was really smart and a good investor and grew the business, and it was worth a lot of money. The other siblings didn't speak to him after that. They felt like as if somehow he had cheated them out of their inheritance, that he had the foresight to know 15 years hence that it will be magically worth something, and we're really discounting the 15 years of struggle that they put into it. And I think we all look at that and say, well, that's silly. But remember sibling dynamics. I mean, there's so much more that goes into a family. You can't really be objective or rational about it. And above all, we want our children to love each other. They're such a tight foursome, and they all really like being together. And we didn't want that to change.
Well, and as we do the legacy of awfuls, I know a situation where the one person in the camp decides, in order to impress other people, they really probably should have a Lexus, if not a Maserati, to impress people. And the two siblings are paying for the other 2/3 of that. But I know other family where the non-directors are the ones with power, and they're decided that maybe you should be driving a used Yugo.
Right.
But everyone is into everyone's decisions, and then you get ones where everyone's a partner, they're all working there, and then everyone has a spouse who has a different opinion on what the bathroom's wallpaper should look like. It's kind of interesting how the different ways where the disharmony can kick in.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, you keep going, Steve. You keep going.
Well, I say getting back to the three jobs, Susie the director, Susie the investor, and Susie the entrepreneur. One of the modes that are out available now that was not there 20 years ago are the companies that are buying multiple camps but need really good operators.
Yeah.
And if one of the Baskins were to want to buy to be the director of Camp Champions, that would be great for one of these acquirers. They don't want to bring a third party in, and they would be delighted to pay the top dollar for the director side of that. So if you were to, this is not exactly what we did, but if you were to sell to one of these people, you can now divide, dollar bill, money is easy to divide among your children. And now the child who wants to be a camp director gets to be a camp director. Probably gets to be paid a little bit more because it's worth it to the other person to have the continuity of family. And the only way they don't do it is that they're bad at it. And I know people will say, well, what if my child's bad at it? Well, you don't want them to be a camp director then. I don't want my child to be doing something they're bad at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, camp's not a safety net.
Right. It's a disservice to the legacy, but it's also a disservice to them.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Well,
So
that's why I wanted you all to be on, because I think there's so many great resources and families that have done it and done it well, and maybe some who haven't done it well that you can talk to, but there are so many of those family legacies. And I know, Howie, you have so many people that you've been able to jay and lean on and bring into that, but I don't know if there are as many resources for camps that maybe aren't going to continue it in their family. And how did you do that? And so I think I was really excited to have your perspective and your story on, to give camps, something else to think about, or to know that there are other options, or how you're doing it, or just people to call and say, hey, Baskins, I heard you did this. Tell me more. So I can think about I have options.
Well, yes, and for all the examples that Susie and Steve have given, there are lots of examples that, despite some of these cautionary tales, some families really do make it work, even despite some of the challenges, and they navigate these things. And, I've had my own experience of navigating tension and this and that, etc. And, you work through things. But in terms of, what I think what Steve and Susie have really done well for us is just present a canvas of things to think about. The great example of Susie and those 3 silos are so important. And
That's
for
why I
me, oh, I love that.
Yes.
That's
Sorry,
great.
it just happened to come up.
Not everyone who's listening can see that, but that was Elizabeth Holmes, I think. But I think very well done. I guess one of my questions as we start talking about this too, and I think for listeners who may be seasoned camp operators, owners looking to some of these considerations, like, you were very lucky you have someone who was within your midst, who you developed a relationship with. Was there a time when you both looked at each other and said, we got to start talking about this? I mean, are there, based on your experience and the people you've talked to, like, do you set a timetable for this? At what point do you send this timetable? I'm in my late 50s. We're probably same vintage around. I said vintage. And so the point is that, and back to your point, my father-in-law, who's 82, says, I am so grateful I don't do this anymore. What you went through, like, and so at what point do you start having these conversations or start thinking about, are we 5 years out from really pulling the trigger on this? Are we 10 years out? I don't think there's an absolute magical number, but maybe speaking to your own experience, was just the meeting of this person who's grown up at your camp and where you were at with your kids, did the stars align at a magical moment, or how intentional were you about thinking about this?
I'm going to answer this one because I have the answer. So remember, Steve grew up going to camp and I didn't. Steve had the dream to start a camp, to buy a camp, to be camp directors. And I kind of initially reluctantly and then enthusiastically went into it. So when I turned 50, I said to Steve, I said, okay, I'm 50 years old. I'm putting in my 10-year notice. Like, when I'm 60, I'm done. Caveat, it doesn't mean I'm done with camp. I love camp, but I am done with being the call at midnight when something's going wrong. Like that I don't want that intensity anymore. And we didn't initially say right away that it might not be one of our children to take over. I mean, that was, we didn't say to them, thou shalt not be involved. I mean, but it was, we were very open about our thoughts. But when I put in my 10-year notice, we didn't start immediately thinking about it. We had a timeline. And so our current wonderful owner now, our co-owner with us, he grew up going to camp and he was a director, and he had said it was always his dream. So we were really lucky. But I will say that when I first met Steve in Boston, he and his brother would start going to camp conferences without a camp. And all they did was meet people and say, we would like to buy a camp someday. If you want to sell your camp, let us know. And so there are people out there, not just, the network of camps that are buying camps, but also individual people who want to buy camps too.
Right.
And so if you've got a longer time frame and you can kind of have the luxury of really making sure you have the right partner, because unless it's not like a house, it's not like you lock the keys and hand on the keys and it's yours now. It should really be a partnership during the transition.
But I'll also say this is one of the places where the new structural dynamics of the industry give you flexibility you didn't have 20 years ago. If you have 20 years ago and you had two problems. One is, can you find someone who you trust to run your camp? And can they afford it? And both answers were unlikely, and the chances it'd be both person and one is super thin, right? What is nice about and I can think of at least 3 groups right now who are, who acquire camps and have a network where they can get, talented people in those positions, that you say, okay, there is a way to get paid and to make sure that they have access to good people to do the job. And so it was wonderful that we had Eric. If we not had Eric, we'd be looking at those other options.
Mhm.
What we would not have done, and Susie said, we didn't talk about our own kids. We like to say if our kids wanted to be in the camp business, that would be great. We would help them find one to buy. But since this is their birthright, I mean, not their birthright, their birthplace, it's all their memories. And I don't know, even if you could split up the money, can you split up the place where they were all born and had their, first great memories, and now someone else is the keeper of that legacy? That would have been hard emotionally. So I think finding that person, you can look back at your old campers, see who are good operators and entrepreneurs, but you don't even necessarily have to sell to them. If you have somebody who just wants to be a great camp director and gets, Kelly's vision or Howie's vision, then you can start to bring them in, build up a team, and then find someone else who can help you buy it. Or you can make it into not-for-profit.
Yeah, there are a number of camps who've done that as well.
And
then you get a board.
Dan Kell does it where that you get bought out by bonds. Another one you could do is just take out a big loan, pay yourself, and then make it into a not-for-profit. You don't get all the money you would, but you have a lot of flexibility with that structure. So there's a lot of ways to do it.
And did you help? So it's Eric, correct?
Yes,
Correct.
So did you, obviously Eric had that dream and it worked out for all of you. Did you help him to figure out how he was going to make that co-ownership work? Or did he have a team, his family behind him that was helping him guide that? Like, how much did the two of you support him? And because what I know is that we are going to have, I hope anyway, right, Howie, because we like to think that we have young hipsters listening, but I do think that there's individuals out there, and they've said it to me, I'm sure they've said it to you, Howie, is, oh my gosh, I'd love to buy a camp, but how do I even make that work? Or, and I think they think a lot about the financial piece, but I'm really curious to know, did you stay out of, supporting him and helping him navigate how to make that work? Or were you involved with helping him figure out how he was going to do that?
We were deeply involved. My previous incarnation was in finance. So he came up with some money. We did a borrowing against the camp itself that helped do the down payment. And then we took some seller debt. This is a shorter podcast than we should go into this, but there's some advantages to someone buying a camp, because if they can write up the assets and include goodwill, you can start to get tax deductions that would not be available to you. So the amount of cash available to him after the acquisition was more than was ever available to us. Mm-hmm. So you were reducing the amount paid into taxes, which then helped finance do the debt service going forward. So it was a pretty elaborate structure. And again, if we had not had 100% faith in him as an individual, we would have gone and partnered with one of these other groups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And but part of it is we wanted to be involved too, because there's some risk. I mean, when you have seller debt, there's financial exposure. If things don't go right, you may own the camp once again. So we've actually absolute faith in him. But even so, I think he appreciates our willingness to be involved too. And because we've been doing it for a long time. And
right.
It sounds similar to what we did in like a contract for deed with the previous owners. And, again, they had to have faith in us, but if we didn't follow through, they got it back. Right. So there's risk on both sides. So I was on that other side of, oh gosh, yeah, if we don't knock this out of the park, it's back to them, which we didn't want either. And they didn't want that for us, but it was risk. We both had risk on both sides. So that's good to know that you were working with him on that piece and heavily invested as well. So I know
and that was our experience as well when we bought 20 years ago, when we bought our overnight camp. We couldn't have, we were very young at the time, and it was, the founder of the camp we bought, realized after giving it a try that his own children were not motivated or had the same passion. And he still to this day is one of the most influential business people I've ever been part of, because he knew when to get out, he knew what his number was, and he was rooting for us, the new ownership group, to be successful. And that was such a great relief to us, because as we entered into a vendor take back for a period of time, which was the only way we could manage doing this, we needed to keep the existing clientele familiar, and our success at those early stages was very much built on keeping the population that the first family had a relationship with. So having them involved was critical, and incorporating them into our experience as new camp operators just was the recipe for us to ultimately experience the success we've gratefully, experienced. But that was such a key component, that business and mentoring and cheerleading and resource relationship was instrumental, because we had every desire to just keep the train moving forward from what they had done. And so I know it's probably for Eric to have this mentorship he's experienced from you guys all these years, and to know that you still have skin in the game and you're pulling for him. It's a win-win, because his success is going to be your success, and vice versa. So that part really resonates with me, because in my own business life as a camp operator, I've relied on the business savvy of certain people and the camp savvy and philosophical savvy from others. And I think it's helped us build what we build. And as young camp people in the industry, you got to hitch your wagon to everybody who's checking off those boxes. And to Steve's example of going to conferences with his brother, like that, and I know we're all in this boat, but I'm fielding lots of calls gladly of people who want to pick my brain, as they do with you guys, and as we're doing right now on this podcast. I've benefited from it, so I'm happy to share my own. But all of what you're saying really resonates with me very much too.
All of us, we've all had the same experience. We had it from the folks we bought our camp from. Both of you have had it from yours. We're passing it on. I mean, you have to. And if you care about the camp, you're rooting for the person, because also you're rooting for the camp, right? When that person succeeds, the camp does too. Absolutely. And that's what we're putting front and center.
Some people ask me, what's the right frame to look at the process of selling or transitioning your camp? And I think, as we indicated earlier, you want to start with your goals. You want to be crystal clear about what has to be true for this transition to go well for you. So our two goals that were preeminent over everything else was, our children can continue to love each other and their grandchildren play for the next century, right? And then also going into the next century, Camp Champions will continue to be an exceptional camp run by passionate people who are changing kids' lives. That was a lot more important than what price we got. That was a lot more important than exactly what our titles were going in or out, or what our retirement denouement might look like, or whether one of our kids were involved. So we kept those as sort of our true norths going in. But what really helped us was realizing that our buyers had goals too. And what is their tolerance for risk? Or what are their fears? And both when we bought our own camp, and now that we're selling our camp to Eric, we wanted to think through what's the right match of the things that meet their goals and meet our goals. And I'll give you an example from when we bought Camp Champions about 30 years ago. Is those current owners wanted a certain price. They just had a number in their head that would make them feel good about selling the camp. It was not really what my brother and I, who had previously been trained in value in businesses, it was a higher number than it was actually worth. Now, around the time, if you were to borrow an unsecured loan on a small business, it'd probably be like 12 or 13%. This was, in the mid 90s. Well, the buyers really believed in us because we'd already run a camp once before. The sellers believed in us. They also realized that they were just going to put their money in the bank if we bought it from them, and they were going to get like 1.5% on it. So we said, okay, if we pick a debt number, so we did a lot of seller debt with it. We put some money down, and then the seller debt was a higher amount than we thought it was worth, but we were paying 4.5% on it rather than 12% on it. So the debt looked like it was worth, call it $900,000, but it really had more of a financial worth, like $800,000. But they were delighted because if we'd have paid them cash, they'd just put it in the bank anyway. So they thought they had won going away. We thought we'd won going away. But the reason we got there is we listened to what each other's needs and wants were. What are you fearing? What do you want going forward? And when you can sort of match those, you get a great outcome. And a really strong recommendation I have for camp directors is spend as much time thinking about the structure of a deal as you would spend figuring out the program for your camp. Like, it's as important a decision as you're going to make. And the more time you spend on it, the better you're going to find something that meets people's needs and wants.
So one thing also that Steve did when we were buying Camp Champions is very clever thinking about the structure of the deal, and it worked both ways, which was a prepayment clause. So if we were able to prepay more debt than was scheduled, we would get a discount on the debt. And considering something like that when selling your business is so important because it motivates the buyer to spend money correctly and minimizes or reduces the seller's risk. So there are lots of creative ways when you really create a partnership with when you're buying or selling the camp. I mean, it's like we said before, it's not like a house, it's not a one and done transaction. This might be a transition. I've heard of camp transitions that have lasted, 8 years. For example, a dear friend of ours, when he bought his camp, the former owners really liked doing special events. So they stayed on and helped with special events for 8 years because it allowed them to still be involved. And then it gave him some continuity, and it gave the existing families of the camp a feeling of continuity, and everybody wins.
It's so interesting because I can identify with that entire story, Steve and Susie, what you say. It was kind of my experience about 21 years ago. But I also think, just to add to that, my experience also included the fact that at the end of the day, the details of the deal have to be negotiated by the two parties that are directly involved, because the people outside of that circle, the lawyers, the accountants, the people with the long letters after the name, they're going to give you lots of good advice, but it's only advice. And at the end of the day, it has to be a kind of fusion of your passions, your goals, and what's realistic for you to make it work, because there's lots of noise all around each of the buyer and sellers in the buyer and seller's ears. At the end of the day, a lot of these things get done because people got in a room, they were vulnerable and transparent and realistic, and there's a lot of give and take. And sometimes the outside people, whether it be your bank manager or your accountant, when I bought our camp, I was in my early 30s, and these much older men looked at me and said, well, this kid doesn't know anything. I'm going to tell him what deal he's going to get. And our partners looked at each other and said, no, we're going to get in a room. Thanks for your advice, but we're going to dig in this way. I'm not discounting that by any stretch. It's valuable stuff. You need that. And I didn't have the luxury of having, a consultant in finance like Steve is, over my shoulder or doing the deal. But I just wanted to add that because that was my experience too. A lot of, at the end of the day, it can really be a beautiful win-win when the parties get together and make it happen. So
I'll throw one other caveat in though. Probably your accountant, the one who's been doing your basic accounting and your tax stuff, is not who you want if you're doing a big deal, right? You want a tax accountant for sure, maybe even a tax attorney. I'll give you a quick reason why. Is there's a way to do a camp as a stock sale, but you write up the assets like it's an asset sale. Now, this is, I know, sounds like Swahili, but there's a reason that's important, is that if you buy my camp for more than its book value, and that's almost inevitably what happens, right? You write up the assets that can now be redepreciated. And if after you've written up the price of the assets, if there's more money, if you paid more than that, the rest comes in a thing called goodwill. And goodwill is amortized for 15 years. So if you end up having, $5 million of goodwill, I'm just throwing a number out there, that reduces your taxes by $333,000, or your taxable income by $333,000 for the next 10 years. That means that the buyer is paying less taxes than you are. So you're putting some of the economics into the deal by taking some of it away from the taxing authority. Well, that's just a win-win. And you got it, but it's a little bit of an arcane law, and its execution is tricky. But it is you cannot afford not to pay an expensive person to do this sort of thing, is part of my advice on that.
For sure. Totally.
So you're right. You get the gist of it, and then you bring in the people after you've explained, never talk down to my buyer.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you recommend a tax attorney. Is there anyone, like, as we close out, as we wrap this up, any other professionals that you would suggest people would use for a deal like this? Or like you said, tax attorney, any other wisdom on that, on who you should get involved professionally?
We had an excellent accountant. It's a very long saga. It's not the one we started with, but it was the one we ended with. And when you're selling your camp, she was able to increase our basis much more than we would have been able to cost it out ourselves. And long story, she ended up paying for herself because she did such an excellent job. And so really, even though it will be knee-buckling expensive, the hourly rates, you've spent your whole life with this one big asset, right? This is the biggest thing financially you're going to do in your lifetime. Make sure that you have really excellent people doing it so that everything's explored.
But other than a tax accountant, when you're asking what else would you want to talk to, maybe a tax attorney if you have a very, very big organization, because sometimes they'll know stuff the other ones wouldn't. And then I would try to go find someone in the industry. And frankly, if they're going to charge you, they're probably not the right people. I think, I'm sure Howie would be glad to take someone's call. I've taken people's calls. I'm not interested in spending more than a few hours, but someone who's done this can really help you. I would probably suggest call 3 people who've gone through a transition. And I would ask for
people especially, or
camp people who've done a transition. And I'd really want to make sure I get at least 1 or 2 nightmare stories.
Yeah, for sure.
So I know what potholes to avoid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for me, because we are dealing with in our situation family at this point, learning lessons learned from the previous generational transition, and nothing severe or tragic, but these are notes. It's really interesting, Susie. You talked about that number you reached at your age where you said, I got 10 more years or whatever. My attitude at this point, and I talked to Kelly about this, is that if I have 10 years, I want to look back at this 10 years that I got it right in every way, that my kids still love each other, that we've set up, everything we can so this 3-generational business can continue to do what it's been doing. And I think that as people who are embarking on this journey, there's a lot of things. It's relationships, it's business, it's strategy. There's so many different components. And I think to Steve's point, there are so many people in the industry who can check off boxes in each of those things that we can all learn from. Go to a conference and seek out those people, or give them a call. Most of us in the industry are ready to take a cold call at some point.
Yeah. I guess one other thing I would say is if you are going to try to pass it to your family, there are people who do that. Family transitional issues that help, because it's a lot easier to second guess your children than second guess their protege. And if you have some kids who are going to be in the business and some who aren't, there are people who do that.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, there's counselors, kind of mediators, and they work across multiple industries, but it's all about how to transition within a family.
Yeah.
That's probably another podcast, but
Totally.
excellent too.
But so if we were to summarize, I would say we're in a different world where the camps are more complicated. Now, the good news is that we have more professional staffs, which makes it easier to transition without just giving it to one person who has to wear multiple hats, which makes it easier for someone else to buy the camp if you want them to. So you want to look at the options, sell to one of the 3 or 4 buyers, make your camp a not-for-profit camp, and get money off the table that way. Borrow some money, distribute to yourself, then make it into a not-for-profit. There's kind of 2 different ways to do that. And in each of those cases, you are disaggregating the director role from the investor role from the entrepreneurial role. Okay. And I would take a very hard look at that, because I would not want anyone to presume that you want to lock in your children for the next 30, 40 years of their life doing something they might not be passionate about. You were saying earlier about somebody who had tried to transition their camp and their kids just didn't have what it took, or maybe their heart wasn't in it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I would never feel right telling my child it has to be an orthodontist because I'm an orthodontist. And, so if you are going to do a transition within the family, then I would really, really work hard to get some of the cash off the table. So you're not just splitting you might be splitting the emotional legacy of the camp, but not also the financial legacy of the camp. So if you could disaggregate those things, you're doing a great service to your family. And so having your child running the camp lower on your list. And I say that knowing that if you're the 4th generation, you might feel like you are disappointing your grandparents in their grave. But I think I would almost prefer that than saddling a child with a job they really don't want to do for the rest of their lives.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. That's a great summary. I really appreciate it. This has been, we could talk for a long time on this one. There's no doubt, but lucky to have the 2 of you to navigate this with us, given your own experience, but also the breadth of experience you have in knowing so many people in the industry who've, gone through so many different scenarios with this. So thank you so much, Kelly. End of the show, inspiration. I mean, aside from this inspiration, which we've heard for the last little while, we always like to end each show with a bit of inspiration. We're going to ask our guests to share some things that are inspiring them. Kelly, same with you. I'm going to kick it off. I'll get it going for, season 4. I just got introduced to Matthew McConaughey. Just wrote a children's book called Just Because. And it's a very short book. It's an illustrated book for kids, but my head spins always in the area of staff training and thinking ahead to getting our staff ready for the summer. He's written a book in couplets around living life and creating conversations that parents can have with their kids. I could totally see the content of this book being a great conversation between us as senior camp leaders and our frontline staff about setting expectations and lessons learned by coming to camp and experiencing all the things that camp provides. So I would recommend it. It's a great book, and he's a good dude. And I had to add some Texas content into this inspiration for our guests a little bit. So I just threw that in there. So it's good though. Check it out. Kelly, or you want to go to Susie and Steve for this one? Let's do that.
I want to go Susie and Steve. Yep, I'll go last.
Okay.
I have a quote, and to put this in context, I was given this quote at the ACA National Convention in San Diego, which was in 2020. And the greeting committee was just handing out random quotes, and it was a sticker, and I put it on my computer. And at this point, we didn't know, how our lives would change. Gosh, we didn't know that COVID was going to be what it was, right? Steve and I personally didn't know the trajectory of our lives at that time. But this quote really stuck with me, and I often look at it for hope and inspiration and just joy. right? So here it is. I'm looking at it right now as we're talking through our computer for this podcast. And it's by Mr. Rogers. Often when you think you're at the end of something, you're at the beginning of something else. And that's what I like to think of our lives too. It's a beginning of some wonderful things that will feel old and familiar, but also new and exciting.
That's great. Love that.
Okay, so Susie's always a 10 out of 10 on inspiration. I always have to go a little bit through the geek route. I'll try to do this short. I got a chance to read an advanced copy of a book by a professor named David Yeager on adolescence. He actually spoke at ACA National about 4 years ago. And his argument is that we terribly underestimate teenagers. We want to say that they don't have a prefrontal lobe, they can't plan. He says, wait, anyone who thinks they can't plan has never seen a 16-year-old figure out how to sneak out of their house. They're capable of great planning, but you have to understand what motivates them. And he has this theory that you can understand and motivate young people if you realize that most of what they're doing is pursuing status and respect. And if you treat them with respect and expect them to do amazing things, you will rarely be disappointed. If you treat them like children and expect them to screw up unless you're holding them on a tight leash, they're probably going to screw up. And I always like to say you rarely get what you hope for, but you almost always get what you expect. And if you treat young people, and they, especially high school kids and college kids, as capable of amazing things and worthy of respect and status, but you hold them to the high standards, because there's really no status and respect if I just give it to you, right? That's sort of the secret sauce with camp, and particularly our young counselors and our older campers, is helping them, help motivate them through what would give them status among their peers and respect from all of us.
That's amazing. Yeah. That's the whole ball game of what we're trying to do, right? These adult, we give them adult responsibilities. And then sometimes if we're not treating them, at the level of the responsibilities that they're undertaking, you lose them. And I think that's it's a really, really powerful way to look at it, for sure. I hope a lot of people run with that one. That's for sure. Kelly, what do you got?
After furiously typing what Steve had to say. Steve, quickly, what was the name of that book by David Yeager? Do you know what the name of it?
It's good. When it comes out, it'll be called 10 to 25. It's not out yet. It's going to come out either the end of this year or the first part of next year.
Nice.
Okay, great. I'm going to write it down. I have two. So one is, now I'm promoting something I haven't read yet, so take that with a grain of salt, but it's on my list. Andy from Tumbleweed was telling me about a book called 9 Lies About Work. And it's for free thinking leaders. And some of the things that were pointed out in it, I really loved. So that's on my list to read was, so 9 Lies About Work. And then the other thing after this conversation that has still stuck with me is the book Entitlemania. Audrey Monkey from Gold Arrow had the guest, he was on there on our podcast, and what I listened to how many years ago just really stuck with me, and a lot of things that he has talked about came back when I hear the two of you talk. So I highly suggest that episode of Sunshine Parenting. I put it in our show notes on the book Entitlemania. I think it's a fantastic book to think about when you're making these big decisions about your business and your kids. So those are mine. They're in the notes. Awesome. All right. As we wrap up, we always like for individuals who are listening, if I can guarantee they're going to want to talk to the Baskins if they have time. And Howie about your different transitions and approaches to succession. So if our guests would like to get a hold, let's start with you, Howie. If they want to get, or not guests, but our listeners, if they want to get a hold of you, how did they get a hold of you?
Sure. You can reach me at howie@camprobinhood.ca. And I would be more than happy to connect and hear your thoughts on our show and topics that you'd like to hear in the future, for sure.
Okay, Steve, how can individuals get a hold of you? And then Susie.
Yeah, I'm Steve B, STEVEB at campchampions.com.
Mine's very similar. Susie B at campchampions.com.
Awesome. And my email is Kelly with a Y at hiddenpinesranch.com. Please don't forget, you can find all of our show notes at crow.ownerspod. You can find the resources that we mentioned in this episode, all of our inspirations in the show notes, and lots of good stuff there. We hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for listening. Baskins, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Your just wisdom is invaluable. It's priceless. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. I know Howie and I are just so incredibly grateful, and what a great kickoff for our next season. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.